Yeah, let's start.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our third virtual conversation. We're so excited to have everybody here. My name is Kayla and I am the Communications and Social Equality and Empowerment Manager for YWCA El Paso. Like you saw when you registered, there are some guidelines that I put in the chat just to keep that in mind. And my function, I'll take myself off screen unless somebody has questions. So then you can put them either in the Q&A function or in the chat. And if they're relevant to what's being discussed or at some point we have time we can do that, I'll pop in. The panelists will know that there's a question and we'll be able to ask that. So if you have a question now that you want us to cover, or if something comes up during the conversation and you want to ask a question, please feel free, and we'd love to have kind of an audience participation. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Dr. Acosta, who is our CEO.
Hi, how are you? I'm Dr. Silvia Acosta. I'm the CEO of YWCA El Paso del Norte. Welcome to our community conversation on gender and race. We are so glad to have you here. We have an amazing group of panelists that are going to talk from their own perspective about their own lived experiences and their own opinions. So we're always excited to have panelists that share their world points of view with us. I'd like to thank Dr. Horak, who is a professor at the University of Texas at El Paso. She's also on the board of YWCA USA and also serves on the board of YWCA El Paso. We are so thankful that she has agreed to moderate this session, and so before we move forward, I think it's really important that I let everybody know what the mission of the YWCA is, because that will center this conversation. So the mission of the YWCA is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And I always like to underline the for all, because we mean for all. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Horak. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Dr. Acosta, and welcome everybody tonight, and welcome our wonderful panelists. We have with us tonight Dr. Kathy Staudt, who is a professor emeritus of political science at UTEP. We have Dr. Irma Montelongo, who is associate professor of practice in Chicano studies and in women's and gender studies at UTEP. We have Kyra Lewis, who is the vice president of the Black Student Union at UTEP. We have Sybonae Acosta, who is a senior at Loretto Academy, and she is also the founder of the Political Awareness Club. And we have Ouisa Davis, who is an attorney here in El Paso and a community activist and very involved in many things. So a wonderful panel. As Dr. Acosta said, the YWCA's mission of eliminating racism and empowering women puts gender and race together all the time. And we try to remember that in the work that we do. Before we were hit with this current pandemic crisis, we were coming together regularly for what we call dinner and dialogue. And we would have 200 to 250 people, and they would sit at tables and they would talk about different types of controversial issues. And those were really powerful evenings. Of course, trying to transition to everybody being at home, we were not able to do those. But in the last few months, obviously, we know that the need is absolutely there for us to continue conversations. Whether we can do them face-to-face or not, we need to be doing them virtually. So we had a panel initially on issues just talking about race and racism. Then we had another visit with Brandon Wolf talking about race and LGBTQI issues. And tonight we're going to talk about race and gender. What does it mean to look at those things side by side? And again, the women, as Dr. Acosta said, that are here tonight as panelists have a variety of wisdom and lived experience and ideas and concepts to share with us. So I really appreciate them being here. So I'm gonna start by asking a question, a general question of all the panelists. And I'll start with you, Dr. Staudt. What does the word feminism mean to you, or the women's movement? And along with that, when did you kind of first realize that that you were a woman, or first started to realize what the idea of gender was in your own life?
Thanks. Two good questions. I think I realized that I was a girl in the rigid gender roles of the 1950s when I was growing up. I saw all the constraints. I saw within my own working class family, economic dependency on the part of my mom. Of course, I didn't have a word for that back then, but I was aware and I wanted to break out of that. And I hope I was able to do that. My real coming alive, my awakeness, so to speak, on feminism came when I was an undergraduate in the late 1960s. I joined the women's liberation movement at my campus. We didn't call it the feminist movement. We didn't call it women's rights. It was women's liberation, and we did consciousness raising. We talked among ourselves and saw patterns. We were struggling against so many injustices back then. When I went to graduate school, I became interested in studying gender, in a sense, and my dissertation topic involved looking at men and women farmers in Kenya, where I did a year-long dissertation research. And I remember when I made my proposal to do that research, I kept getting responses from my committee like, are you sure you're in the right discipline, political science? Shouldn't you be in anthropology? Isn't there women's studies that you could go into? Now, mind you, I wasn't excluding men, I was including women, but that's the way so-called science was back then. And so, so I was able to do the research and finish. And I got my PhD in 1976. I had a year position at Grinnell College. Then I applied for the job at UTEP, which was advertising women in politics as a class. And so that's a tribute to UTEP. There were 250 other applicants at the time. I was glad I made it to the short list, and I'll just stop there.
Thank you. So there's a lot of history there that of the movement itself in your own life experiences. Great. Dr. Montelongo, what about you? When did you sort of realize about gender, being a girl or a woman, and what does it mean to you?
So I think my earliest memory is when I remember, because I have two brothers. I grew up with two boys. And so I had my own room. They shared a room, right? And then our parents, they performed pretty traditional Chicano gender roles, right? Mom stayed home and whatnot. And so those gender roles were imposed on us from my very earliest memory. And I think that would go back to 5. I think that's as far back as I can remember. But I knew already that, I'm a girl and they're boys, because I had my own room because I could not share a room with them, right? Our toys were very different. My clothing was very different, right? The way my father treated me was I was daddy's girl, right? Because I'm also the youngest. And so it was just stark. And so I think I've been a feminist my whole life. I just didn't know it, right? So because before I went to grad school, I owned a construction company. Oh. And so I battled every day against, entrenched, ugly sexism in a totally male-dominated field, right? And I wasn't silent about it, right? I got into lots of verbal confrontations and whatnot with men because they'd immediately question, why was I in that space, right? So I was that long ago, but I didn't know that when I got to college, of course, right? Those crazy liberal bastions that are ruining this country. My horizons were just, expanded, because then I started learning about, racism and sexism and those things that we experience every day. We know we're experiencing them. We just don't know the theories about them, right? We just don't know the terminology about it, but we're living it every single day, right? And then when we do get to learn what is feminism, what is, racism, what is sexism, that usually happens in higher ed. It just does. right? And so for me, that's when I got to put the whole package together. And to me, in its simplest form, feminism is equity, right, amongst the sexes. Economic equity and political equity, social equity. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Kyra, Lewis, what are your thoughts on these questions?
So I grew up in a single parent household with just my mother. So my perspective is a little bit different when it comes to like gender roles, because seeing my mother do everything, mow the lawn, grill food, cook dinner, and clean and do everything and work on top of it, it definitely made me feel like I can do anything. And then we come from a very athletic background. So we play basketball, a very rough and tumble kind of sport. So the way and we carry ourselves is, you know, very lots of confidence. We stand behind, you know, our opinions, and it wasn't until that was brought to me as like, hey, you need to stop doing that. Like, you gotta tone it down, or you're gonna be intimidating to men, or you're gonna, you know, it's off-putting. Like, it wasn't until those started happening, like, women shouldn't do that, or, you know, you're a little too rough for us right now. That's when I started to realize, like, oh, what I'm doing isn't normal, or what my household structure isn't, you know, a society normal picture. And so that's when I started, it's not that it changed very much for me, but it made me definitely realize the world that I was walking in once I got confronted with those things. And it wasn't until, when it comes to like feminism, it wasn't until, unfortunately, higher ed, my sophomore year in college, one professor gave me a book on, it actually was about feminism and womanism. And so that actually really broadened my horizons on, I always knew that I was, you know, pro-woman, you know, everything that falls in feminism. But it wasn't until I could actually, like I said, like the doctor said, put a name to to the theories that I was already perpetrating, that I could say, like, oh, I'm a feminist because of this, or I'm also a womanist because of these things. And it was really reflecting on it for this forum. It was really kind of saddening that I waited that long late in life for something that I feel like people should be introduced to early on, so that they know, like, you know, this is what feminism is, this is what sexism is, this is what racism is, and these are how these things intertwine and affect us in our day-to-day lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Sybonae, Acosta, how about you?
For me, I think it was about 6th or 7th grade when I realized that I was a Latina. And that's just because I lived in Irvine, California, and I went to a school that was predominantly Caucasian and Asian. And, you know, going through puberty, I started to see a lot of changes in myself, but like the body I was seeing change was different from my white counterparts. So to me, a picture perfect body was skinny, a stick straight, because that's what I was seeing my friends, and all the guys liked them, and I was different. I had, you know, curves, and at that time, it's not what I saw as beautiful. And I think that when I moved to El Paso is when I also found, I mean, I've always been a feminist from my mother, but I think it wasn't until I moved to El Paso and went to Loretto and like was in an environment that uplifted girls, because Loretto's an all-girls school, and like taught girls to be strong on their own without, you know, having to tame their voice and their spirits, because that's really what Loretto's taught me. And through that experience of going to an all-girls school, I think it's really taught me about what feminism means. And it's not about, oh, I don't like men. It's about, no, we're equal, but we have just as much to say as a man does. Yeah.
Good points.
And can I just interject real quick? I just wanted to tell Sybonae that real women have curves.
Yeah. There's a great book to read. Another great book to read. Ouisa, Davis, how about you? What are your thoughts on when you sort of realized about gender and what feminism or the women's movement means?
Well, I was very lucky all my life, from the moment that my mother brought me into this world, to be surrounded by feminists. But before I finish answering that question, I want to give honor to one of the greatest feminists of our community, who on July 5th went on to glory. That's Bonnie Alexander Leslie, one of the most instrumental feminists in El Paso, a teacher at Eastwood High School, later an administrator, always an educator. She was my teacher throughout my life. And I know Bruce and his wife and children are missing her. So if we can keep her in thought. Also, you know, this is the centennial, 2020 is the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which was the culmination of the activity of the suffragette movement. And I just kind of want to remind everybody that we have our own suffragette, Maud Sampson, who as a Black woman tried to advance the right of Black women to vote along with the right of white women. And I want to hold that up as we go into conversation, because later as our conversation develops, we'll probably come back to the issue of women and race. I was blessed enough to be born in the middle of the civil rights struggle to a white man and a Black woman who were not allowed to marry or love in Texas, but defied the law with the help of George McAlmon and were married in Ann Arbor. And this is where I was born. And El Paso is in my blood. It runs through my soul. And so I've always known I was a woman. I've always known I was a feminist. I went with my mother to burn bras in the 1970s and marched with my parents in the 60s, and then again in the 70s during the Black Power movement. So, you know, that kind of activity has always been activism. Making the world a better place has always been ingrained in my very core. I've been very fortunate to always be employed by feminists. So the men with whom I've always worked always honored and respected women: Jose Rodriguez, Ken Powell, Bobby Pearl, Terry Pasqualone, Bishop Armando Ochoa, men who recognized the importance of women's voices and encouraged them. And so I've been very fortunate that I've managed to be surrounded by feminists all my life. So part of my task is making sure that I can help other women, especially young women, make their own mark and find their own voice.
Thank you. So Kathy, Ouisa just kind of mentioned some of the history. And you talked about an important part of the women's liberation movement was that consciousness raising, you know, learning. And so will you spend a few minutes, you know, giving us, I know there've been books written on this and we're just asking you to do it in a very short time, but giving us a little bit of history of the women's movement in the United States.
Okay, you asked me to reduce this to a few minutes, so I'm going to rush, and I'm going to hope that people ask a few questions later. I'm going to divide it into the first wave, which is 1830s to 1920, and then the second wave, which is the late 1960s to the current era. Very briefly, in the first wave, for which the struggle was suffrage, it started out on a good note. There were abolitionists and Quakers who were pushing for women's suffrage. They met at state conventions. Frederick Douglass spoke in 1848 in favor of women's suffrage. Everybody has heard of Sojourner Truth, who in 1851 also spoke at one of the state conventions. However, after the Civil War, with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, when women's suffrage was separated from suffrage for Black men, the women's struggle, the white women's struggle for suffrage took a separate, segregated turn. And while there was wavering support, sometimes yes, sometimes no, for making alliances with a variety of women, in the end, it was a movement that was organized in a racist society. So it reflected some of the racism of that society. Suffrage did have regional struggles. The Deep South, of course, was the most resistant of all. In fact, Mississippi has not even ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution until the 1980s. The Western states were more progressive. But in 1920, we finally have national suffrage. Women from various groups were working for that because they realized it was a tool. Black women, Mexican American women struggling for suffrage because it was a tool that could be used to try to push for other reforms. However, one of my favorite feminists, Emma Goldman, wrote that true emancipation begins in a woman's soul. And I will use that to transition to the second wave of the women's movement. And I'm going to divide that into women's movement people and then women's rights people. And the women's movement people, and by the way, I have my little badge on here for women's liberation, which we all wore in the late 60s and early 70s. The women's movement people had very little faith in the existing patriarchal political system to pass laws that would be of use. So women took it upon themselves to try to liberate themselves. There were body issues that they talked about. I remember, I don't have it to show you here, but there was a pamphlet called Our Bodies Ourselves that sold for 35 cents. It was this thick, and it had all information about our bodies and about rape and about reproduction and birth control and all those things. This was the era when women volunteered to shelter battered women in secret places so that their boyfriends or husbands couldn't come after them. This was the era when women volunteers staffed rape crisis centers. This was the era when there were a couple of superstar feminists. We all know the names Gloria Steinem, Flo Kennedy, Charlotte Bunch, women who had practiced a variety of feminisms, Black feminists, lesbian feminists, liberal feminists. There are so many feminists. You notice I dodged that question about what is a feminist because there are so many different types. But there were a lot of superstars who weren't necessarily accountable to the to women in various communities around the country. And so the women's rights movement, meanwhile, and it wasn't really a movement, those were establishment organizations that were working for reform, and they were willing to work within the system. And they had a structure. They weren't structureless like the movement people were. And they were able to push for various reforms that were important. Equal employment opportunity. There used to be sex segregated ads in the newspaper, even in the El Paso Times. Help wanted female, help wanted male. Don't even bother looking at help wanted male. One of my students did a research paper on that, and the El Paso Times changed its policy. Equal Pay Act, equal credit. Women's studies programs were started, including at UTEP, 1981. I was one of the co-founders. And we co-founded before UT Austin did. So yay, UTEP. There were reproductive justice issues, Supreme Court decisions, Roe v. Wade, other body issues. And these reformist groups were able to push legislatures to get funding for battered women's shelters, funding for rape crisis centers. And meanwhile, the percentage of women in Congress and state legislatures had been increasing from 3% to finally what we have now, about a quarter, which is still way under. And women were earning about 59 cents to every dollar that men were earning back when it all started. Now the average is about 80, but if you break that down by race and ethnicity, Mexican American women are earning about 40% of what white men earn in this community. Black women also earning much less than white women. And then, by the 90s, we have some breakthroughs in feminist theory with Kimberly Crenshaw, who created the concept intersectionality. And now for the last few decades, we're always talking about the different experiences of different women. And rather than assuming that all women are alike and they all have the same experiences. We also benefited from the work of philosopher Judith Butler, who talked about the social construction of behavior and treated behavior as a kind of performance that ranged on a continuum, not just a male, female, but all kinds of other constructions of performance of one's gender. So we still have a long ways to go. Even though the suffrage women was obtained in 1920, it really wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that Indigenous, Native American women, Black women, Mexican American women were really able to get rid of the voter suppression techniques. And of course, we've seen a revival of that. So maybe in 2065, we ought to have a celebration of suffrage for all.
I hope it doesn't take that long, but thank you for a very long history in a very short time.
Okay.
Irma, I want to talk to you because you had said that you knew the experiences you were having, but you didn't know the theories. And so Kathy has given us this wonderful, broad brushstrokes about the general women's movement in the United States. But as somebody who teaches in both Chicano studies and women and gender studies, can you kind of start to complicate that a little bit for us and speak from the Latina Chicana experience?
Yeah, so I would add a third wave to Kathy's paradigm, right? Because sort of the way that we see it is the second wave of starts around in the 1960s, right? It's part of the civil rights movement. And you have people like Betty Friedan, right, that are really popular. And the main issue, I mean, these are privileged white women, right? These are women who, at the very least, have time to sit around and debate feminism, right? They're not working, cleaning homes, or, whatever. And so their biggest issue is patriarchy. And that's what it is. It's patriarchy, right? And so there's not really a space there for Latinas or Black women or Asian women who are dealing with way more intersections in patriarchy, right? They have racial issues and class issues and, sexism within their own culture, right? And so this first wave and the second wave really are not spaces for women of color. And so you don't really have this woman of color voice present, explicit, until you have this third wave, right? And I think that can be marked around the 1980s. And so what's going on there, at least for Chicanas, for Latinas, is that the universities are graduating their first big cadre of PhDs. And so these women then are producing all of this new research and literature on their own communities, right? Written and or spoken in their voices through their experiences. And so now you have this canon that's being created by, Latina academics and Black academics and Asian academics. And so this third wave is actually global, right? East Indian feminists contribute huge amounts of work. African feminists. It's a global sort of woman of color wave of feminism, and and that's where we are right now. We're still in the third wave, right? And as far as Latinas, I think that again we've always been feminists. We just didn't call ourselves that, right? And I will take us all the way back to conquest in 1519, right? And a woman by the name of Malintzin Tenepal. You probably know her as La Malinche, right? The traitor, Cortés's lover. This is a brilliant woman that speaks a number of languages, right? A woman with incredible agency who is confronting a conquest and, sort of mitigating her survival and the survival of her people, right? So she's a diplomat. She's not a traitor, she's a diplomat. Right? We could jump forward to the colonial period and I would bring up Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, right? An incredible author, poet, philosopher, composer that is manipulating the Catholic Church to get her voice out there, right? and the monarchy. We could jump further into time and we have the soldaderas of the Mexican Revolution, right? We have Emma Tenayuca, a labor activist in San Antonio. Frida Kahlo, right, was not quiet. Dolores Huerta. Did they call themselves feminists? Probably not. But were they feminists? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. They're taking on the mantle that all feminists take on in their moment in time, right? But Chicana feminism is something that was born out of the dynamics of the Chicano movements, right? And so what were the dynamics? The dynamics were patriarchy, sexism, right? Something called cultural nationalism, which is basically this, you know, overarching pride in your culture, right? And culture in the 1960s to Chicanos is very traditional, to heteronormative Chicanos, right? It means that the man is the breadwinner and the mother is the nurturer and you know, the stay-at-home teacher and whatnot. And so I think that often feminist movements are born within larger social movements, right? So the Chicano movement, then, the women that are participating in the Chicano movement are quickly realizing that they don't have a voice. It's a hyper masculine space, right. Very sexist space, right? They can bring them coffee, they can bring them, you know, whatever it is, and they can be there, but they don't have a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. And so you start to see then these women gather together and realize that, you know, their political consciousness is being born, that, you know, they're not only do they have to fight the sexism within the Chicano community, but they have to fight racism in the larger society, right? And classism as well. And so, you know, they're starting to understand that their lives are more intersectional. You know, it's not just, you know, white society is dominating me, right? So the men are fighting racial subjugation, right? But the women quickly realize that they're fighting racial subjugation and sexism within their community, outside of their community, right? Their fight is much more complex, if you will. Yeah. And then we'll have a schism within the Chicana community, right? They will break apart. You will have what is referred to as the traditionalists, who are okay with supporting the movement the way it is, right? They're okay with, you know, supporting what the men want. And then you have the feminists that are like, no, you know, we need to do something about these gender relationships. So finally, if you jump into the 80s, then you have your educated Chicana PhDs, Emma Perez, Antonia Castañeda, Dina Gonzalez, Alma Garcia, Yolanda Leiva, right? The list goes on and on. Then the story of Chicana feminism becomes much more inclusive and much more complex.
Thank you. There's a lot of history to this movement. There's a lot of depth and breadth. And it's important to contextualize that history and really remind us where we've come from. It's also important for us to see where we're going, right? So I want to turn to Kyra next. And you said in your opening remarks that it was really coming to university that opened your eyes, higher ed. And so we just heard, you know, what the kinds of things that you learned. But now as a young college student of color, what do you see now within this movement? Do you see we're in a third wave? Do you see we're in a beyond that? Or how would you discuss it if you were going to talk about the women's movement today for young women like yourself?
I definitely do think we are in the third wave. We're in a place where people who look like me are able to have a platform and a voice and be able to speak about issues that pertain to Black people, to Black women, and to our struggle. And it really allows us to talk about what intersectionality is, because as a Black woman, not only do I have to worry about racism, I also have to worry about sexism. I have to worry about, you know, class issues. And those things can also affect the way or that we interact with other Black people, with Black men, with other Black women. also with other women of color, because that's still something that, you know, a lot of people don't understand the difference, how I'm a Black woman, not a woman of color, or a Black woman and a woman of color, but not all women of color can be lumped together in that person of color category, because we all go through different things. One thing that that Dr. Irma talked about was about, you know, the traditional, what feminism was. And, you know, when I hear feminism, of course, it's something that I want to jump behind, because as a woman, I would like to support, you know, women's movements, progression in all fields that women are in. But then, like I said, it was my sophomore year. It was one book. It was Eloquent Rage by Dr. Brittany Cooper, that introduced me to womanism. And womanism, it was introduced by Alice Walker. She was the author of The Color Purple. She also writes a book called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, where she talks a little bit about womanism. And she says, you know, womanism is to feminism what purple is to lavender. And so it really is just more of something that resonated more with me as a Black woman, because it centers the family unit, you know, the Black family, and it looks at, you know, the race, gender, and socioeconomic status as those affect the Black household. And it just, it really is more based on the experiences of women of color. So it has something more than just patriarchy that the feminist movement has. And in her book, she also talks about her struggles with spirituality, which is something that especially Southern Black women have to have a whole nother dynamic to maneuver through. And that also brings its own patriarchal issues that kind of suppress our voices in a lot of different ways. She also speaks about how she felt, and during the you know, the Pink Hat movement, the Women's March in 2016, and how she really struggled with whether she wanted to put, you know, her feelings as a Black woman aside in order to stand with the rest of the women that were already marching, already knowing that, you know, it was 51% of white women that voted Trump in, and now there's so many other white women, or so many white women who are protesting now. She was very torn, and it was something that really resonated with me, because it's something that I could relate to, like, to where do I fit in if this is what feminism is, and 51% of white women voted for someone who is openly sexist like this. It's like, where do I fall in this dynamic? And so it was really womanism for me that allowed me to see that, I guess I really didn't know what intersectionality was, but that's what it brought to my spectrum. And so yeah, that's just kind of what I have been able to see and been able to move through as of today. So I would say that the third wave is allowing for those types of things to happen, for the womanism or conversations to happen, so we can talk about the different things that affect different women. And like you said, you know, no woman walks the same walk as another woman for all those different reasons. But that's definitely what the third wave is bringing to the forefront, I think.
We have a question from Portia, and I think anybody, but since you were just discussing this, Kyra, that what do we think will close out this third wave? You know, what will be the significant moments looking back in history that we remember from this third wave that we're discussing?
Shoot, hopefully there is no closeout to it. Hopefully it continues to progress, and we can just see, you know, the reform that we've been wanting to see for so long. When it comes to specific reforms that I can think of is, you know, in the you know, the medical field and the judicial field, like, there's so many things that attack Black women specifically that no one really thinks about. You know, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die giving birth than white women, and that's something that systematically means there's something wrong, you know. And so it's hopefully the third wave doesn't end until we can kind of address those things. And so, yeah, I hope that answered the question.
And hopefully it doesn't take until 2065.
Yes, hopefully not until 2065.
Sybonae, I'd like to go to you next. You had talked about, and you can be unmuting one. Okay, you had talked about, you know, what it was like to go to Loretto, to go to an all-girls school, and you had also, at this all-girls school, you started this new organization, the Political Awareness Club. So as a young woman, as a young Latina, what for you, how do you respond to the history, or what the movement looks like right now, or how do you see it playing out in your own life or in the lives of your fellow students?
Right. So I think it's important that, you know, as the youngest one on this panel, it's important for me to understand my history so I can know how to move forward, right? Because, you know, they say history repeats. So in order to create progress, it's important to know who you're walking in the footsteps of, right? So that's what I try to take into account when I am, you know, talking in my, for example, my club. I like to talk about the past and how it affects the future, right? So in what I found really interesting was that in, yes, although Loretto is, you know, super good to find your voice as a woman, I also find it like when I'm taking my classes, you know, for example, AP US History, which is a class I just took this junior year, it was a very whitewashed history. You know, we did talk about, you know, the civil rights movement, we did talk about the Civil War, but as a Latina, I hardly saw any moments where they talked about the Chicano movement, right? So you have to go and you have to Google that stuff on your own. And so when we talk and we're educating students today, it's important to educate the whole spectrum of students. You know, we cannot continue to whitewash history. So I think that as the youth, what I'm doing as a feminist is I'm trying to make sure that feminism is something that is achievable for all people, you know, people of color, including, you know, Caucasians, because as a Latina, you do have a hard time trying to find where you fit in feminism, and that's something that I've also struggled with. Lucky for me, I have, you know, amazing parents that have taught me my worth. They've taught me what it means to be a feminist, but having to share that information to my other students and say that, you know, yes, you are a woman of color, and yes, in the 1920s, you know, it's a very, like when you say that women got the right to vote in the 1920s, that's a very whitewashed history, because it wasn't until the 70s where there was the language barriers were taking off. So a lot of Mexican Americans, especially in the Southwest, were not able to vote, especially women, since, you know, there was no translations for people voting. So it was another way to segregate and discriminate against people of color. So I think it is taking the past and applying it to the future that's really taught me how to be a feminist. And I hope that moving forward through, you know, my clubs, voicing my opinion, that I'm able to educate, you know, my fellow peers and those my age.
That's great. And I love that the youngest person on the panel is the one talking about how important the history is. Because, you know, it is good to kind of remember our foremothers, but also then there's got to be a future to the movement. It can't just be about the past. And Ouisa, I want to turn to you next. I feel like Kathy and Irma and Kyra, they all mentioned a lot of the foremothers of the movement, but in your opening remarks, you mentioned some of our local foremothers. So,
well, and more importantly, I kind of want to speak to Kyra's point for a minute, but before I do that, I have to give honor to Dr. Staudt, Our Bodies, Ourselves, 1990s edition. I have the original one. I read this when I was about 8. My mother was a feminist, I'm just saying. But when it first came out, yeah, So, no, but Kyra, we come from a community of matriarchs. But within the matriarchal system of the Black community, and I use the identifier Black, not African American, because not all Black people are of African descent. But within the Black community, there is a struggle. Although the matriarchal structure is very strong, there is a struggle with the men. Especially within the church, within the Black church, it's very difficult for women to hold positions of leadership unless they're married to the pastor, the bishop, but on their own, it's very difficult. So I kind of want to honor that, Kyra, because you are speaking this truth about womanism. And this is a truth that we as Black women have lived with and seen imaged. And we have to always remember that there was never acceptance of Black women within the equal rights movements. Black women were pushed to the side. Black women were told to take that issue to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, although supported and held up by the women of the Black community, was led by the men. We don't hear a lot about the work of the great mothers of civil rights. We hear about Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson and John Lewis, but we don't hear about our mothers. But one mother, a Black mother, who founded the suffragette movement here in El Paso was Maud Sampson. And I think it's really important, Kyra and Sybonae, you're young enough to vote, to talk to your peers about voting. These women bled for that right. And so it's very important that you understand. Maud Sampson was excluded by the white community from working for the enfranchisement for women. And she even went to the national office and was told that once they confirmed that she was in fact Black and there was in fact a Black chapter, that issue was not worthy of inclusion. So that's one thing that I think we need to look at when we talk about intersectionality and Black women. When we talk about feminism, we've kind of had to do it within our own community structures. We did not have the ability to rely on the Chicano movement or the white power movement, I'm sorry, the white suffragette, or I'm sorry, equal rights community. We were kind of pushed to the side. And even now, as we are living in this 21st century, Kyra, you're going to experience racism in the workplace. I've experienced it, just like I've experienced sexism in the workplace. I've experienced racism from women in power in the workplace. I'm very happy that Carmen Rodriguez is on, she's watching us, and she just sent a chat talking about her experience as a Chicana feminist, because Carmen Rodriguez was one of my mentors and one of the people who held me up through this. So yes, there will be a struggle. The reason the Women's March became fractured was because the issues of Black men and women being killed by police officers and other citizens was not worthy of being addressed in the Women's March. But number 45, or individual number 1, as I prefer to call him, had already started to create the climate in which we are living now, which thankfully has caused worldwide protest. But because of that, we have to remember that women, well, I don't know, I can't speak to Hispanic women, but I can speak to Black women. Black women are not necessarily included in the quote feminist action of today. And so we do it in our own ways. We do it in our own groups. We advocate within our own communities and workplaces and environments. And the Greek organizations do a lot. The civic organizations do a lot so that we can promote one another. So I think that here in El Paso, which I know Anne, you wanted me to speak to specifically, Black women are excluded. The only time, you know, we were on that call on June 19th with Tommy Gonzalez, and he talked about how he placed a woman, a Black woman, in power, not because she was Black. Well, I should hope not. You know, because we still hear this. Well, you didn't get that job because you were Black, it was because you were qualified. Duh. that still is going on here in El Paso. Black women are not able to get jobs the way Hispanic women and Anglo women are, and Asian women are. Black women are required to speak Spanish in order to gain employment, and many of those women are transplants. And so, of course, they work 2 or 3 jobs because they are still single parent families or households. Now, the men are beginning to experience the same exclusion in El Paso, and are, after deciding to retire here, are being forced to leave because of this requirement that everyone speaks Spanish. I speak Spanish, you know, but a lot of people don't. They move here, they migrate, and so they don't speak Spanish. So there has to be a way for them to earn a living and feed their families, and they shouldn't be excluded because of that. So, as you know, we continue this conversation about feminism and racism on the border. I think we need to speak truth about it, and we need to talk about it, because it's only through speaking that truth and listening to the voices of these young people that anything is going to change.
We have a really good point in the chat and another question in the Q&A, but to start with what came up in the chat, and Anne, I don't know if you want to decide who the question goes to, but she's talking about that she's experienced more discrimination, she says more hell as a Black woman from women than she has from men. And I know that's part of the intersectionality that we've been talking about, but we talk about feminism, and this is kind of what Kyra was talking about, more about womanism, but how we can maybe address that, that racism within women.
And I think I'd love you guys to think about that, how women interact with each other, and why various groups have had to be formed, like Ouisa was talking about. Also, Irma, you kind of mentioned that, you know, for a long time, the movement, not only were white women more able to sit around and talk about feminism, they were able to sit around and talk about feminism because Black and brown women were taking care of their children and cleaning their houses, right? So like I think it's a very good point, and I'd love to see who would like to talk about that. Like, what is it that draws women apart from each other, and what is that? How is that continuing to hold back what a movement could be?
So I'll take a stab at it.
Oh, Irma, yeah.
So in India, there was this group of people, they were called the subaltern studies, right? And they were basically Indians who became educated after the British were kicked out of the country, right? And there's a very prolific scholar, her name is Gayatri Spivak. I think she's at Columbia. And she wrote this article called, "Can the Subaltern Speak?" Right? And basically what she's arguing in that article is that when the colonized take their power back, they kind of become the colonizer because the system is already in place, right? So I think that when women who gain power, right, who've never had power before, gain power, then they act in that way, right? They act within the system that already exists. They don't recreate it. They step in and act the same sort of oppressive, demeaning way.
Well, and even to take it a step further, they're more cruel.
Yeah.
They're more cruel and can be more cruel than the men.
Yeah, and you know, we said, just to piggyback off of that, I talk a lot with my students about, especially my Mexican national students who cross the border to come to school, and we talk about the custom agents and the border patrol agents and how they behave. And they consistently tell me that the Mexican American agents are much more cruel, much more demeaning than the white agents. And again, I think it's that sense of power that.
Yeah, and when women, quote, make it and reach whatever professional level they think makes them whoever they want to be, they will go as far as to create a scenario where another woman is somehow threatening their power, their voice, their authority, their how they present themselves, and will then try to ruin the reputation, the employability, the character of that other woman. And that's kind of what we saw happen in the Women's March. We saw these two groups of very powerful women who could have melded together this message of inclusion, and instead there was one camp pushing out the other camp. And then it didn't end with just pushing them out. It ended with name calling and, you know, Twitter wars. And Kathy can testify to the beauty of the coordination of the Women's March here in El Paso. You know, we include all those issues when we have that march. I was very sad that it didn't happen this year, but so yeah, I do think, Irma, you're absolutely right. It's something about getting power
within a system that already exists, right? So you strive to
get
be
in
on top of that system, and then when you get there, you act accordingly within that system, right?
Like the crabs in the pot.
Exactly.
I want to Kathy next, because Kathy kind of had her hand up, but then I do want to hear from both Kyra and Sybonae what the perspective is of younger women on this question. But Kathy, what were you going to say?
I was going to make a couple of points. It sounds like some people on the panel and also some people in the chat room are talking about internalized oppression, where women or members of subordinate groups take on the values of the dominant group and use it against other people in their own group. And I don't think all women have internalized oppression. I don't think all Chicanas have internalized oppression, but I think it's out there and we need to be aware of it. So that's one point. Another point is that not all women are alike. Not all men are alike. Why would we expect all women to be alike and behave similarly in hierarchical institutions? And then my third and final point is that besides colonization, which in El Paso is a huge example of a colonized population historically, and even in contemporary times with some of the things happening downtown and the developers and so on. But besides colonization, we also live in an advanced capitalist society which fosters competition among people from a very, very early age, and competition over upward mobility, over being powerful, over exercising power on and over other people. So I think we just all need to be prepared for these kinds of differences that are caused in the larger structures of society.
Kyra,
and I know you were going to jump to Kyra and Sybonae, but to play off the same question for those two, just because we talked a lot about why this might be happening, if the two of you want to speculate or discuss what can be done, like within either the womanism movement or in schools or in our own families, like what we can do to kind of make actual changes to what was just brought up in the chat.
Yeah, I actually liked a lot of the points that doctors were talking about, because it really does have to do with with power and the weight that a white woman's voice, a white woman's words have had as a impact on the Black community. A perfect example is Emmett Till. Very textbook example is how one white woman's not even truth, but her lie can cause such a domino effect, because it's arguably where a lot of the civil rights traction started, is people seeing Emmett Till's body in that casket, and so that even going even further back to slavery times, the power of what white plantation wives had, when it comes to the day-to-day torture of Black people and Black women. It's a very historical thing of weaponizing race and weaponizing a very victim image that white men feel the need to protect their women. And so that is, I feel like, the seed that started a lot of the power dynamics that we see today. I think things that we can do in order to move away from that. I think obviously is having the conversation, but really policy needs to be put in place to where, you know, how about racists don't get in those places of power in the first place? You know, how about, you know, I don't want to say, you know, the mental health part, but definitely some type of rigorous evaluation so that we know the people that we are hiring and putting in these places of power are people that care for all people. I think a really recent example, the Las Palmas Hospital situation, where, you know, a white supervisor told nurses to go, you know, on a boat back to Mexico. How does the supervisor, you know, how does a racist become where they're supervising and have so much power in people's day-to-day lives like that? You know, a lot of people say voting, and I think when they hear voting, they think like presidential voting, but we mean like, you know, the district attorney, did that end today?
Yes.
Or that ended today. So yeah, so, you know, voting in our local government and people who can have change immediately, that's very, very important. I think that addressing when we hear something, we say something. When we hear the racist comment that our supervisor just told someone else, like, you know, there's strength in numbers. We have to be able to come and defend against those types of things. And most importantly, I feel like the very uncomfortable conversations that we have with our families, because you know, it's very hard to tell our grandparents or even our parents or our uncles, people who are older than us, it's very uncomfortable to check them on their racism, check them on their prejudices, check them on their sexism, but it's something that's very, very necessary in order to try to implement some type of change. And I think those are the type of things we can do now, and hopefully that they will have a long-lasting effect.
Excellent. Kyra, thank you so much for that. Sybonae, you had your hand up. What are you thinking about this issue?
Like, in the day of technology, like, you see a lot of things circulating and, you know, people talk, whatever, and people are posting on Instagram, and there's a lot of other people, such as like Asians, Latinos, that think that certain movements don't apply to them because they have this structure of a model minority, and I've seen that come up a lot. And I think that like, especially today with the administration, like, in order to pit other people against each other, they've constructed this whole system in which, like, you have to fit this certain mold, and now we're against each other. So it's this whole minority mindset that has really warped every movement. You know, with the whole women's rights movement, you know, it's either you know, it's either white feminism, Black feminism, Latino feminism, Latinx feminism. It's all of that, but it's not, you know, one thing, because now we are being pit against each other. And I think that in order to get over that whole it's because, okay, my grandparents, right, they have always said, you know, date within your own race. It's always, you know, you stick within your own people. You don't go out, you stay with your own group of people. But that's because as a Latino, you're always told that, you know, African Americans, you're given these sort of stereotypes, and I'm sure this happens with every other race. You're giving these stereotypes of what other minorities are like and why you should stay away from them, which I think ends up creating conflicts within, you know, workspaces, within when you're really supposed to be on the same team. You know, we're all fighting for the same rights, we're all fighting for the same voice. And so I think a way to change that is to start viewing, you know, everyone is equal. And I like, it seems simple in words, and it seems simple, just, you know, treat everyone equally. And that's what, you know, the United States is saying, that, oh, everyone's equal. But in order, you have to start changing your mindset and like getting rid of those stereotypes, those built-in walls and barriers that you have against other people, and breaking those down, that you can really start to see a change in policy, and you can start seeing a change in the way society is constructed and the way that we treat one another. And so that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Sybonae. Kayla, were you going to bring us another question?
Yes, and it has to do with a lot of what we're talking about. The question in the Q&A was specifically talking about some of the points Ouisa made, but what concrete steps must we as a community take to dismantle anti-Blackness that's entrenched in Latinx communities? And what opportunities exist in a city like El Paso, as a predominantly brown city, to illuminate and compel Black, Indigenous people of color to work in solidarity to disrupt and destroy racism, misogyny, patriarchy, etc. And they mentioned specifically the fact that our city was recently attacked by a racist, and how we can all come together, what opportunities exist now, or what can we do to create those opportunities?
You know, and that's a really good question, because we're kind of in a different arena in which I move. We're addressing an issue of a discovered racist, or somebody who certainly puts out racist ideas. And, you know, and we're struggling with, because of the power of the institution that is involved, we're struggling with how do we address this? And what we've learned is that it's more widespread than we would have imagined. I don't know why, because we're in Texas, but, and it's very bad. And we're looking at conversations, but learning that nobody is open to hearing the side of the people who feel attacked, kind of what you were talking about there, Kyra. So I think that a united front is always the best response. And so that's what and dialogue. And so that's what that's my plan, is to get people to talk, give them a space to talk, have a round table, have a listening session, and then get the community together, as such as it will be, because some people won't participate. And then from the community surface, some concrete steps, one of which I hope is an actual rule that basically excludes a proponent of racist, sexist, or otherwise discriminatory attitudes. You know, and I think that's one of the things. The other thing is leadership. And I think a lot of times people look for a certain style of person, an elected official, or quien sabe qué, quien sabe cuándo, instead of looking maybe at the young people right here, the educators, the most unsuspecting people. One of the most incredible things about Bonnie Leslie is that she helped create the Texas Women's Political Caucus. And she was a high school English teacher, you know, and she created generations of women across the state who vote. And now, and at the end of her life, was creating educational plans to change, to address these issues. And I think we have to look at the non-traditional people to lead us in those conversations.
Excellent. I feel like Kathy, you had your hand up a minute ago, and Irma did too.
Irma might be first, and then
Okay, go Irma, yes.
Yeah, so Latino cultures are very entrenched in whiteness, okay? This goes all the way back to the colonial era, where, you know, the Spanish bring this notion of racism, modern racism from Europe, and that has carried on. And so Latino cultures, Latinx cultures, in my opinion, need to look inward, right? And you need to stop this crap about, you know, you know, you should marry whiter to marry up, and, you know, to lighten up the family, and quit saying things like, oh, look at this baby, he's so beautiful, you know, he's so güerito, you know, and things like this, and start looking inward. Okay, because we have this long history of an entrenched whiteness. If you watch the novelas, I think I mentioned that I have my elderly mother living here with me right now through the pandemic. And so from, I think 7 to 9, we watch novelas. And I'm sitting there doing this social commentary the whole time. I think she's sick and tired of me, right? But in these series, right, everybody is light-skinned, blonde hair, and blue-eyed. And that's not really what the majority of us look like. That's what we strive to look like, right? And so it's a bunch of BS. We have to look inward, and we have to stop that. It's time. Like, we're done. We're cooked. We need to stop that.
That issue of yeah, I mean, Irma, you're bringing up the issue of colorism, which is another ism, right, involved. Kathy, I'm gonna go over to Kyra really fast because she had her hand up, and I'm very interested in your perspective too, as a Black woman at a university that is predominantly Latina. So what were you going to add? And then Kathy, we'll go over to you right after Kyra.
Actually, my perspective is actually I can see both sides because I am a biracial Black woman. On my mother's side, she is Mexican, so the Sybonae sentiments of make sure you marry in your own race. Like hearing that from the Mexican sides of my family, we all kind of just sit like, what do you mean? But it is very, very much so some internalized racism because a lot of people kind of negate the fact that there are Black Mexicans as well.
Yeah.
That there are Black people who are Mexican nationality as well, or there are Black people who are mixed with Mexican or with some sort of Hispanic, with some sort of Latinx. There's so much, it's so much bigger than just, United States, Mexico, Black, white. It's so much more than that. And I think, Dr. Irma really, really hit the nail on the head when she said, it's a lot of inward looking. There's a lot of it's unfortunate, but, racism in my own family, a lot of pulling in and trying to wrap their head around the fact that they have Black cousins, so they can't be racist, but you're very much so racist with your Black family still. So it's a lot of conversations. It's a lot, I think in El Paso specifically though, Black culture really isn't represented fully. I know Miss Davis spoke on, the Greek organizations that play such a large part in, Black culture and amplifying Black culture. It's really lacking here, and it's so difficult to try to get some of those things started, even at UTEP, who is so, forward thinking and is a minority campus. It's really hard for us to get some of those things started. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to a Juneteenth celebration, but in Texas, Juneteenth is a very big thing. And I've lived in El Paso for a while. And when I moved out of El Paso, I learned just how big Juneteenth is celebrated. And that's something that's really lacking here. So there's a whole cultural, section of knowledge missing. So what people think of, of Black culture is usually very negative, because those are the stereotypes that have been perpetuated, from generation to generation. And it's just a real lack of knowledge, I think. And so if we want to see some type of change in El Paso, I think it has to be, some openness to learn about, Black culture, some openness to learn or to receive some of those things that are going against the stereotypes that they were taught.
Yeah.
And just to quickly respond to that before you move on, because I want to follow up with what Kyra said. Kyra, there is a celebration of our culture, but because it's always been minimized in El Paso, and I'm born and raised El Pasoan, and because it's very hard to get community and government to support Black activities, we do it within our community. We do it within the Greek organizations. We have our gatherings, like we go to the Deltas luncheon, we go to the AKA luncheon, we go to the Q's banquets. So we do it within the community, because there's never been an interest. And even when, and we're working on things. So when you join the Black Roundtable and partner with us, then you'll be able to take part in those things and bring your ideas to Kwanzaa our Kwanzaa
Absolutely.
celebrations and things like that. So I'm really excited to meet you today.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Risa. Kathy. And then we're going
Okay,
to Sybonae to answer this question.
yeah, a couple of reactions. I salute those who emphasize the everyday choices that we make in our life. Every day we are confronted with multiple choices, what to buy, whether to call people out, whether or not to, call people out when they laugh at rape jokes, when they laugh at racism, etc. So we make choices, let's do that consciously. Second thing is when Sybonae talks about we are supposed to live in an equal society, yeah, at a symbolic level, one vote, one person, etc. But I think a lot of the inequality is in economic issues, and there are so many public policy changes that can be made to, not everybody's going to be totally equal, but to lessen the inequality. Tax policy, opportunity policies. There's many ways we can reduce the wretched inequalities that have been growing over the last few decades. A third thing on, I think it was Kyra who said we need to screen for racism. And I think what pops out for me there is all over the country, people are talking about ways to transform police culture from the warrior culture that embeds racism inside of it into one that serves the variety of different needs that people have when they make calls to 911. Does our police department screen people for racism, screen people for hatred? The warrior culture in our police department is something that in other cities, people are really moving on. And they're moving on it in coalition-oriented ways. Someone said, we need a united front. Yeah, we need to work in coalitions. We can't do it all by ourselves or in one organization. We need to work together. And sometimes you've got to make compromises when people work together. And then finally, the points about leadership. Remember that leadership is, yes, running for office. And I hope that especially the young people will run for office. But it's about more than running for office. It's about getting involved in organizations. It's about saying in an organization when someone has a good idea, it's about saying, okay, I'll take that on, I'll organize it, I'll get people together, I'll do the work. You learn so many skills when you exercise leadership within organizations and outside of organizations.
That's a great segue to Sybonae. I want to hear her thoughts, and that's exactly what she's doing, is starting an organization, to learn more. Sybonae, you had your hand up a minute ago. What were you thinking about?
I just think something really special about my generation is that, we have, what I was saying, we have so much technology at the tips of our fingers, and something that I've really seen is my generation banding together to become knowledgeable, to become accepting, to go out and vote. On TikTok, for example, there is so much movement going on within the TikTok community, and everything that happened with the whole Tulsa rally when the TikTokers whole stadium, that's amazing. My generation is finding ways to maneuver through old politicians and to find a way to make our voices heard. And to me, that's something really special, is we're using our technology platform and our wits and cleverness to try to outsmart these politicians and really make our voices heard. So I really found that through technology and through becoming more and more accepting and loving of one another, and really trying to make our voices heard, because I'm not 18. I'm not going to be 18 when it comes time to vote, but I am making sure that as part of Gen Z, I am making my voice heard, and I'm making sure that those who can vote in my grade go out and vote. And so it's about posting, it's about making your voices heard, but it's more than that, which right now it's kind of hard to go out and protest and stuff. You can, but with coronavirus it's hard. But more than just posting. It's making your posts into real life actions. So people posting about, you know, feminism or the Black Lives Matter movement, it's about going out to the polls and then making your voices heard, you know. And it's those little things that I think my generation has found a way to, you know, maneuver through, being young but still making sure that we're making an impact within the country and the world.
I would also just like to tag on to what she said is I've never signed so many petitions in my life. Twitter, Instagram, there's so many petitions that are picking up traction because people are simply retweeting or sharing. And so that's a really good point on how we're using technology to really actually promote change, because some of these petitions are actually, we're seeing, you know, concrete change, cases being opened, or, you know, cases being revisited, stuff being implemented. So that's a really, really good point on how we're using our technology to our benefit.
Thank you, Sybonae and Kyra. You've set us up perfectly for just the last question, because we're starting to get close on time. But before I ask the last question, I do want to tell everybody who is listening, as well as all the panelists, please follow YWCA El Paso on social media. Please go to our website, ywcaelpaso.org, and sign up for newsletters. We are going to be having our 15th annual Race Against Racism. This year it's going to be in August rather than January, so there'll be information about that. But we really want you to know the things that we're doing, and we want you to suggest other things for us to do. Kayla, did you have something to add to that?
I was just gonna say, I'm gonna put, we haven't like released the virtual Race Against Racism to anybody yet. We're gonna do that tomorrow, but I'm just gonna put it in the chat if anybody wants to get a head start on registering. And it supports our racial justice, our social equality, our women's empowerment, things that we do from with our tiny babies to things like this, to our community conversations. So hopefully everyone can join us for that virtual Race Against Racism.
And so to close us out today, Kyra and Sybonae both talked about voting, about petitions, about protests, but what are your last thoughts on next steps? Like, there's so much work that's left to be done, but if I were to ask you to, like, what's something that you really are pinpointed on, and what can people do? What actions can people take to try to move a feminist agenda, an anti-racist agenda, an anti-classist, homophobic, all these isms that are tied together in so many ways. And so I'm going to kind of go in the order that we started in. Kathy, I'm going to ask you first how you would respond to that. What are the next steps? What's the work that needs to be done, and how do we address it?
Well, maybe my previous points were related to how I would answer this question, and that is think about how every day you can make choices to confront issues or let them slide. Don't just let things slide. Second is work in groups. There's power in numbers. There's power in coalitions, and work at the local level. Everybody's so excited. I mean, yes, we definitely need to vote in the presidential race, but there are so many important races here locally. Races for mayor, races for city council reps. So we've just finished some runoff elections. Because at the local level, these are people you can talk to. I mean, you can actually get on the phone, you can have meetings with them once the pandemic is over, get involved in local issues. So I could say more, but, and there's a question in the chat room just about how to work with men who are just dedicated to keeping things the way they are. You know, let's recognize that there is toxic masculinity out there. There is, and there was in the 19th century, it continued in the 20th century, and continues even now. Some of it's really dangerous. And so that's why we need to work in solidarity with other people to confront these issues, because alone it's very tough to do.
Thank you. Excellent points. Irma.
I would say run for office. Run for office, right? We need women, and we need women at all levels at the table, right? I think they've said, right, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu, right? So we need a seat at the table, at the local level, at the state level, at the national level. And so we need to run for office. I know that yesterday, the runoffs, if I'm not mistaken, we put all women in. I mean, all the primaries were won by women. Am I not right? I mean, on the blue side. I don't know about the red side. But still, that's what we need, right? I don't think we've ever had a female DA. Have we?
No, we haven't. We have not.
And so I'm not saying, and I'm not saying that this is the answer for everything, but we need to see what it's all about, right? Can there be change at that level? Because we do have a woman in that position now. We need a woman mayor, right? We need more women on the county as county commissioners. We have one woman now, as of last night. We have one woman on the county commissioners board. We need more than half of the commissioners to be women. The same with city council, right? The same at every level of politics. I mean, it's great to get involved, but if we don't have a seat at the table, we are going to be on the menu.
You know, but going back to that point, Irma, because I'll be honest, you know, I was the first Black woman judge in El Paso, and 5 years of that taught me that I am not supposed to be a judge. That's not where my gifts are. I'm an advocate. Yeah. And so for me to run for office would detract from very important advocacy work, whether it's with my individual clients or with the committees that I form to attack systemic racism and exclusionary policies. So while I think everyone who feels a desire to serve at a higher level should run for office, sometimes you can do something in a maybe not such a public way, and still have power. You know, creating task forces and holding systems accountable. You don't have to be an elected official to do that. And that's what I'm talking about when I say, you know, we want these voices to lead the conversations, you know, these elected officials and things. It doesn't have to be. It could be Kathy Staudt, who I know as a feminist, intellectual, teacher and educator, and who can lead the way to a place where people can come to understand. Sylvia Borunda Firth was just elected as the president-elect. She's going to be our next president of the State Bar of Texas, the first person from El Paso and the first Hispanic woman to serve in that capacity. And she's walking into a bit of a explosion. I don't want to call it a mine field, but it's certainly something exploded. And she's having to create structures to resolve this. And she's not pulling from the elected members of the bar. She's looking at, you know, people like me, you know, just
so
I think the people that will create the conversation and the climate to surface, who have credibility within the membership to surface. And so sometimes I think those committees and just applying pressure to the stones is just as important as standing on top of that rooftop.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we need to be at all levels of society, at all levels, right? But I mean, when you're in a, you know, women are the majority in the nation, they're the majority in the world. Slightly, but we're the majority. And so when you live in a city where the political leadership is completely male, you know, then that's an obstacle for us moving this movement forward, which I think was the question, right? How do we move forward locally and, you know, statewide and whatever? Well, that's an important way. I mean, do we need representation at all levels and organizations and everywhere? Absolutely.
Also,
at the State Bar of Texas, everywhere. But we need political leadership here in El Paso right now.
But we also need women running our corporations here.
Yeah.
All of the wealthy corporations in El Paso are now, there used to be one, and I can't remember what it was, where there was a woman corporate CEO, but she left. But we need women at the top of the electric company, of, you know what I mean, of the banks,
Yeah.
Harriet May was the president of GECU for decades, and that's why GECU is so big.
Yeah. Well, we're really getting short on time, and I want to let our two future politicians and CEOs, hopefully, Kyra and Sybonae, we're all going to donate to your elections when you're ready to run. If you guys will close us out on these final thoughts, what do you think needs to be done? What are the next steps that you guys think of?
I think the most immediate things that can be done are probably have a lot more to do with accountability, with controlling the things that impact us personally. So the people in our circles, the comments that we say ourselves, like, are there things, sexist or racist things that I'm perpetrating without, the microaggressions that I'm saying? Is there anything that I'm doing that I can check myself? And then the people around me, that could be, bosses, friends, roommates, even professors, classmates, teachers, stuff like that. Are there things that I personally can hold accountable, even if it's not, publicly, like, "Ooh, teacher, you said this wrong," but, an email, anything like that, something to hold ourselves accountable. I think, and another thing is getting active on social media, because for right now, that seems to be the safest and quickest thing to get out a lot of information in a really fast way. And so that's what, when it comes to the petitions and the forums like this, social media, those type of things to spread knowledge, spread awareness, increase accountability. Those things I think will get an immediate positive change for our communities here, but it's not the policy change that we need to still continue to strive for in the future. But if we can hold ourselves accountable, that means that people who have some sense of, have some moral compass are going to be those who are going to elevate in those fields, who are going to rise in the ranks, through the banks, the politics, the groups. If we can start with holding ourselves accountable, maybe we can avoid, the racists in high places that affect us so heavily here.
Yeah, good points. Sybonae.
I think moving forward, we just need to keep making people uncomfortable and keep having discussions that make people uncomfortable, and poking at spots that people don't necessarily want to talk about. Because if we continue to not talk about important things, then we're never going to get anything done. And I think just making sure you're going on social media, you're talking about it, like what Kyra said, like, keep talking, don't stop the buzz. With everything going on with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, like, it's not a goal that you end and meet. It's an ongoing process that requires generations and generations to continue the work done. That's right.
Beautiful. Kayla, what did you, I see you popped in.
Yes, I just wanted to let everybody who's our participants, we had some amazing questions that we didn't get to. This is something we want to continue, and if we need to bring back members of this panel, because we had some really great questions, and everybody's responding how amazing and how great this conversation has been. We can talk about that, but we will at some point try to host some sort of event where we can get through all of those questions that are still pending.
So I just want to say thank you to everybody. This has been an extremely informative panel. I love all the different perspectives. I think it is always important to remind ourselves of our history, both as a nation and as a city, but I also am very heartened and enthusiastic about what the future holds for our nation and our city in the women's movement and in many other movements. I think that I love Sybonae saying we need to make people uncomfortable, and I love Kyra saying we need to hold ourselves accountable while keeping our eyes on the policy issues, right? Getting out to vote. So thank you all so much. Please, as Kyra said, join social media and follow the YWCA because there's a lot of information we want to share with you, and we want to hear from you as well.
Thanks for moderating.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a great evening. Love being with young women and great women thinkers.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Guys.
And I also just want to say that we, you know, our future looks pretty bright.
Doesn't it?
It does.
Absolutely.
Yeah, amazing.
I know. No. Thank y'all so much. We've learned so much. So we really, it's a ongoing process. We really appreciate it.
For us too, and we learn from you. So
Yeah,
teach us.
and we're looking forward to it. We're gonna go pop some popcorn right now. We're gonna be waiting.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Everybody
Thank
stay
you.
well.
Stay safe and good
Good
night,
night.
everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Good night.